Redfall is not being abandoned by Bethesda, even though for many of us it might seem that is the case. I actually argued recently in a video that that's probably the best course of action to take with a game like Redfall. There's just not enough there to invest in. Best just to sort of leave it into the history and the dustbins of gaming. But according to Pete Hinds recently in interviews, he visions this game as being one that will go the distance. It will be one that they really try to fix and get into a better state, but also one that people will be playing 10 years from now. And I just want to look at an article from Insider Gaming that sort of pulls out a couple of snippets. But before I do that, I kind of want to recap what happened with Redfall and sort of make my case as to why I just think they should abandon the game. Now, that's going to come into play even after I look at Pete Hinds' comments, because I have my own thoughts about, is this a game worthy of even talking about in a couple of years? And if you don't remember, when the earliest gameplay footage started surfacing, some of us questioned whether or not the game looked any good. It looked dated. The AI looked like it was kind of weird. There was the infamous IGN gameplay footage, and everybody criticized the person playing. Admittedly, they played pretty poorly, but it was my opinion that even that sort of bad footage really betrayed some of the bad things in the game. It put on the forefront, made it very clear that the AI was poorly designed and that the gameplay and even the player feedback when shooting enemies and things just wasn't designed all that well. Well, in defense of the game and the people that went and played it at a capture event, there was a montage that was put together on Twitter, and it started circulating with claims from the people who played it and the people who were reviewing it that this was a fun game, that it was going to be a good game. Well, then it came out, and it was so terrible that even the people who were sort of defending it ahead of time just started sort of walking those statements back, claiming that the game didn't run well at the capture event. And then we sort of had the thought that what in the world happened to this game, and we got an article from Bloomberg, from Jason Schreier, sort of an autopsy on the game, running down through the fact that they didn't want to make the game initially. They were sort of told by ZeniMax they were going to be making a multiplayer game, and they're like, that's not really what we want to do. We don't even know if we can do that. Multiplayer games tend to need more bandwidth, more people. And they actually hoped that when Microsoft acquired ZeniMax, the parent company above Bethesda, the folks at Arkane Austin were hoping that this game would get canceled, that it would just get shelved. They did not want to bring it to market. So that's essentially what led to probably the worst game launch of this year, maybe one of the worst game launches in history, only maybe outdone this year by Gollum, which isn't saying much. So this statement and these statements from Pete Hinds I find a little alarming, because from where I sit, there is so much wrong with the game. I'm not really sure why they would be dedicating these resources, and I have my own questions about whether or not they'll even be allowed to. So I'm going to jump a little ahead in the article to this spot right here that says, in an interview with GameIndustry.biz, Hines was talking about the chaotic nature introduced by having lots of bugs present in a game. In this interview, Hines touched upon Redfall, stressing that despite not getting the start they wanted, remained sure that people will still be playing Redfall on Game Pass 10 years from now. And then they entertained the question, did you give up on Redfall? Now, focus in on that, the idea that people will be playing this 10 years from now, because there's kind of two things I want to think about in the wake of these comments, whether or not there is a game there that you'll be thinking about in 10 years, and also how do games function on Game Pass now that we're sort of in this era of, as I've said before, if you get acquired by Xbox, you're no longer just a game developer. You are a Game Pass developer, and that may start affecting the games that come out and how they're built so that they can sort of serve the aims of the Game Pass funnel more than just a traditional buy-to-play model that video games have been in for such a long time. So continuing here, did you give up on Redfall? It was a pretty terrible game, that's for sure. That's Insider Gaming saying that. It had almost no redeeming qualities, and that's why it has almost been completely forgotten now just 4 months after it was released. However, Pete Hinds doesn't see it like that. Here's the quote. "We're going to get it to be a good game because we know, as a first-party studio, Game Pass lives forever. There will be people 10 years from now who are going to join Game Pass, and Redfall will be there." I do think maybe they're misrepresenting a little bit of what he's saying. I don't necessarily think he's saying that this is a game people are going to be talking about and playing for 10 years. I think what he's saying is that we're a first-party studio and Game Pass lives forever. We can't have people logging in 7 or 10 years and then Redfall sitting there in a terrible state. Like, that's kind of what he's saying. I don't necessarily think he's saying what some of the headlines and some of the snippets have implied. This does not sound like they view this as this ongoing, long-scope, 10-year game. Just that, look, we're a first-party studio. We've got to consider what a game like this does and how it looks from an optics perspective of the consumer logging in to Game Pass. Now, that could be coming from Microsoft, and I'll be interested to discuss this a little further. Let's just get back to a couple more things before we move on. In the interview with GameIndustry.biz, Pete Hinds stressed that Redfall is still being worked on, and there are things in the pipeline that will, quote, make it better. For instance, there's a 60 FPS upgrade that players thought would be delivered shortly after release. That's just one of the many things that could be done or added to make the game a little bit more tolerable. Now, I will say this, the 60 FPS doesn't matter at this stage. The game was so bad that 60 FPS is a minor issue. That's sort of an understated thing, right? Like, yes, the game should have 60 FPS. Like, what are we even talking about? There was nothing graphically in the game that was keeping it from hitting 60 FPS. I didn't see anything in the game that even looks remotely next gen with respect to graphical fidelity, lighting, world size, even the enemy AI. I just didn't see anything. So adding 60 FPS to me is not even in the hemisphere of what I'm concerned about if you want me to come back and play the game. That's sort of like window dressing. Yes, 60 FPS versus 30 is a deal breaker for people like myself. We don't want to play a game that feels like an old gen game. But this game, in my estimation, is so bad that 60 FPS wouldn't make a difference. I would play it for the lulz, and that'd be about it. So, ending here the article before we get to some of my thoughts about the core game. In his own words, it's still a fun game. I don't agree with that at all. He used Fallout 76 as a working example, stressing that the launch wasn't flawless, but now it is, quote, insanely popular multi-platform game. What do you think? Does Redfall deserve a second chance? I don't know how insanely popular Fallout 76 is. I looked at the Steam charts. It didn't do all that well and still isn't doing all that well with respect to daily player base numbers. Maybe there are way more people playing on Xbox or other locations. I do know the general consensus has been that Fallout 76 really turned things around, right? But, I mean, to use his words here, insanely popular multi-platform game, I would want to see some of the numbers. So, there's a couple of things to think about. I think there's two things to think about in this discussion. First, people coming back to Redfall or dedicating time to Redfall, okay? From where I sit, the core gameplay and the core game is so bad, I encouraged, even in my own video, like I basically said, they should abandon this game. I think there's more harm done by spending bandwidth on it. I don't think you're ever going to get it to a state that it won't just remind everybody how bad the game is. Are you going to rework all the AI systems? Are you going to rework the combat, the content loop? The graphics aren't even that good. I'm not even talking about performance. I just think the graphics in general, it looks kind of like an old gen game. So from where I sit, you're going to do more harm by going back to this game and trying to like patchwork it together to make it presentable, whether that's 60 FPS or DLC. We know there's 2 extra characters that they owe to the people who bought the Bite Back edition. And if you're going to be doing those sorts of things, all you're really doing is reminding everybody how bad this game is. I even said you're better off refunding, giving back, doing refunds to anybody who bought the Bite Back edition and being like, we're scrapping all content plans for this game. There's not a strong enough foundation to even build on. Plenty of games have had comeback stories. I always champion No Man's Sky as an example of this. But I believe No Man's Sky had a foundational sort of technological advancement that they could sort of capitalize on, the way that game works with procedural generation and the universe itself and space exploration and all of that. They had so many things right that they just sort of had to build on top of that. They also had a lot of things already in the pipeline, stuff that was sort of lost when they experienced the flood in the studio. So they were already kind of ahead of the curve with respect to like adding things after the fact. But when I look at Redfall, my question would be, are you going to start from the ground up and rework any of these things? Like, I feel like the character models and the graphics are incredibly dated. The content loop itself is very strange. It doesn't feel like a modern game. It feels sort of old and odd, just the way that everything sort of flows. The enemy AI is probably some of the worst I have ever seen. And if you don't rework those things, all you're going to do is get everybody's attention and be like, hey, come back and check out Redfall. And as he's saying, it's a Game Pass game. I'll have thoughts on it being a Game Pass game in a moment, but now you're attaching the value of this game to the value of Game Pass, and people might start thinking, I don't know why I even have Game Pass if these are the kind of games that I'm going to be getting, and if they do some big update and it doesn't really move the needle on quality, playability, replayability, fun, whatever. He says it's a fun game. I think it's a funny game. I think it's easy to laugh at it and to mock it and make fun of it. I've not seen a single Xbox outlet, podcast, YouTuber, nobody. They don't want to talk about this game. They don't want to draw attention to this game, right? All eyes are on Starfield, both before and after Starfield came out. Nobody really wanted to broach this subject. I did a video saying, hey, where's the 60 FPS patch? We still haven't seen that happen. I mean, Jedi Survivor took a handful of months to do it, so I'm willing to give a little bit of leeway here. If the game launched in a state that wasn't ready, going back and having to add performance mode, or in Jedi Survivor's case, they completely reworked performance mode. I know that's a lot of work, so I'm not going to like armchair devs say, oh, they should be able to do this relatively quickly, but hold them accountable. Ask where these sorts of things are. Now, on the subject of this game functioning as a Game Pass game, I don't know if that's coming from Bethesda or that's coming from Xbox, because I'll be honest with you, no one will care about this game in 10 years. They just won't. I don't think you have that special secret sauce. You don't have that hook in Redfall for anybody to care about this game in a year or two. Okay, we'll always refer back to it, kind of the way we refer back to Cyberpunk as one of the worst launches ever. Redfall's now sort of taking that moniker, especially now that, Cyberpunk's about to have Phantom Liberty and really turn the corner, and everybody's going to be thinking of it very differently. Kind of the way that, The Witcher 3 launched and was very buggy. They fixed all those bugs, and then everybody talked about how great The Witcher was. Cyberpunk can sort of, in a way, rewrite its own history, and then Redfall will get to carry the moniker of one of the worst game launches ever. And I think it takes a special type of game to maintain interest for a really, really long time. Like No Man's Sky obviously has achieved this. Games like Destiny and others have managed to sort of live well past what seems like their expiration date or audience interest. You just think, oh, eventually people will not want to play them anymore. Well, I see the possibility of a game functioning on Game Pass as a long-standing game, one that keeps getting updates, one that keeps getting fine-tuned. I actually think that's more possible and way more likely to happen with Starfield. I actually look at Starfield and think, if they really dedicate some time into reworking the UI, reworking some of the content flow in the first couple of hours to get the player onboarding to be quite a bit better, if they even put out a performance patch, there's a lot of information coming out about the way that game was optimized. They could easily get Series X, 60 FPS mode out there, and that'd be good headlines for Starfield. And I think that'd be good value to Game Pass. Now, you obviously have to be careful with any of the games coming out getting anything special on the Series X, because there's way more Series S customers and they're focusing on the Series S more. So there's an optics challenge there, I think. But as far as a game being on Game Pass and being ongoing and getting updates and getting content and being seen as a bearer of the flag, if you will, like they're sort of carrying the flag of Game Pass and saying, hey, here's a great reason to be on this subscription service, I just don't see the potential there with Redfall. Now, it would be the biggest comeback story in history, because I even think, as bad as Cyberpunk was, it had more core elements that were good and worth getting to, especially if you look at how the game performed on PC. It tended to score better and get a better response from the PC crowd. Even from the earliest of days, there was at least something there that was hooking people. Redfall doesn't even have that. It just doesn't have a central hook or central driver. The player numbers have never been anywhere that you would consider to be good, and the reviews obviously are all in the toilet. So this would be the biggest comeback. I'll say it. This would be a bigger comeback than Cyberpunk. This would be a bigger comeback than No Man's Sky. Destiny's had its own little comebacks here and there where you feel like the game's kind of getting stagnant, and then they kind of all of a sudden change everything and rework things and, completely change the game to some extent. I don't see enough of a foundation there for Redfall to do that. Now, I'm happy to be wrong because I always root for games to have a second chance and like a comeback kid story. And Redfall would be, I think, one where Arkane, especially Arkane Austin, they could sort of wear that proudly. Like, hey, we didn't want to make this game. We were kind of forced to make this game. We hoped that it would get canceled. And now that it's out there, well, we're at least going to take some pride in our work and fix this thing. I happen to think that's one of the major barriers in this game ever getting anywhere to a respectable state, because the people working on it probably don't want to work on it. They didn't even want the thing to launch. They didn't want to make it. They hoped it got canceled. That's not the team. That's not the people that I would want trying to fix my game. If you look at Hello Games and the passion and the heart and all the love that they've poured into No Man's Sky, it's evidenced in the content. It's evidenced in the game's quality and its updates and its content and just how far the game has come. You don't see that, I don't think, in Redfall. I think even if they're getting pushed by Microsoft to fix it, even if they're being sort of funded to fix it, they don't want to. Like, why make them? That's largely why I said just leave it behind, just abandon it. But according to Pete Hinds, that's not the plan. So where do you stand on this? Do you think Redfall could turn it around? Is this a game that you would jump back into? Do you see games like this maybe struggling to function on Game Pass where, look, you got to get that game to a better qualitative state because it represents the brand and you had a really bad launch? Or is the concern that because they need to get games out at a cadence to feed Game Pass, this will always be the dilemma of games come out too early and then they slowly get fixed? And hey, if you want to keep playing a game as it gets fixed, you got to stay on Game Pass. Those are all sorts of potential problems, I think, that come from this ecosystem. Leave a comment below, or this typically rolls over into a members-only debrief. So if you want to be a member, you can click that join button. $5 gets you into all my extra content every month. If not, I do a free live talk show in the morning as well as these uploads. So make sure you hit subscribe and the bell button. That way I can see you in the next video.